welcome everybody today to our March, first installment of March Curator Conversations for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I want to thank everybody for showing up on this wonderful day to join us for this conversation about women in the military. Not only is March Women's History Month, but today itself, March 8th, is International Women's Day. So it's really fitting that we have this conversation going on today. Joined by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Assistant Director, Mrs. Jennifer Van Haaften, and also by the processing archivist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, Mrs. Brittany Strobel. And they have a great conversation today that looks at women's veterans in service, and they're going to be looking at diaries, manuscripts, reminiscences, and personal letters of female veterans, and really asking two important questions. What did military service mean to them at the time that they joined, and what their lives were like, or how it affected their lives later on after they got out of the military? So without further delay, I'm going to turn this over to our panelists. But before I do, I would just like to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in providing these free programs to everybody. They do a fantastic job of supporting us and really letting us just expand our audience and expand our vision for the museum as we provide these virtual programs for everybody. And I'm going to ask the executive director of the foundation, Ms. Jennifer Carlson, if she could just put the link in the chat, so that way everybody can find information for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation if they would like to join or just like to get more information. And then also, if you have questions for our panelists today as we're going through the conversation, you can submit those questions via chat, and we'll put them into a PowerPoint and present them to the panelists at the end of the conversation today. So please, if you have any questions, please use the Zoom chat feature to submit those, and we'll get those all answered for you at the end of the conversation today. Like I said, we're joined today by the Assistant Director of the Museum, Mrs. Jennifer Van Haaften, and also by the Processing Archivist of the Museum, Mrs. Brittany Strobel. So ladies, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours, and have a great conversation.
Thanks, Eric, for that introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Jennifer Van Haaften. I'm the Assistant Director at the Veterans Museum, and I'm glad you've joined us today to hear more about the stories in our collections of women who joined the military. Leading the discussion on this topic is Brittany Strobel, and I'll let her tell you a bit more about herself.
I'm Brittany Strobel. I'm the processing archivist here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I started here as an intern back in 2012 and was hired on full-time in 2016. And in the interim, I was working here as a volunteer and as part-time. So I'm excited to get to share with you some of the stories that we have in our collection.
So Brittany, before we get started, I wanted to point out that although you tried to find more stories about women up into the present day, you discovered that we have detailed information about women from around World War I and World War II, but as we progress into the present day, we have fewer and fewer collections moving closer to the present. So can you talk about why that might be?
That is the case throughout our collection. We have really good documentation of the Civil War, which makes sense. We started with the Civil War. Civil War veterans started our museum, and then World War II, the level of population that was involved in World War II, it makes sense that we would have more collections up through then. And then when you start getting into Korea and Vietnam and the Persian Gulf War and the current conflicts, we have fewer and fewer collections overall. And then, of course, there are fewer women represented in those collections. Now, we did have a couple collections that I pulled in high hopes, but they were very thin on personal materials. We had some orders, some photographs, but very little to be able to tell someone's story.
Yeah, so those are really fascinating. Are there any other areas that we might be missing that we might want to also add to in our collections?
You know, that's a great question. As you look through the slides today, you'll see that we have a lot of white women. These women are actually all white. That was not a conscious decision. That was just the product of our collection. We would love to have a more diverse collection, top to bottom. We would love that. I started my research and I pulled over 200 collections that mentioned women. And then from there, I kind of winnowed down to, okay, who do we have personal things from? Who can I show a photograph of? What do we have? And in doing that research, I realized that specific to the archive, we really lack that diversity. And we're trying to get out there into the community to gather more of those stories so we can better tell the story of Wisconsin veterans. But, you know, I really focused on the archive. We do have oral history programs that expanded beyond those, that white women group, specifically the Do Tell and the I Am Not Invisible projects. I am not the caretaker of those materials, and I only had so much time. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to include any of those stories today, but I think, Jennifer, if I'm right, if we have some time, you might have a couple of stories to share from those.
I might have a few of those, so I hope to do that. I did get a chance to help with our I Am Not Invisible exhibit, so I got to know those oral histories intimately. But, you know, why don't we start like from the beginning, and let's talk about what roles women served in the earliest conflicts, and then also, can you explain how women's service evolved over the years?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can all see my PowerPoint. Perfect. So this is one of my favorite images. It's World War II. It's a parade in Hawaii. But roles in the military for women go all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And logistically speaking, at that time, the only real roles that were allowed to women were in healthcare and nursing specifically. And then after the war, the federal funding to pay those women who acted as nurses during the war stopped. So all of those women left federal service. They were not veterans at that time. They were simply hired by the government. And healthcare for soldiers was handled by the Army within each unit and regiment, each different encampment, basically. And then during the Civil War, there was a call for nursing again. They needed more healthcare workers, and Dorothea Dix was appointed the superintendent of women nurses for the Union Army in 1861. The organization of nurses was less formal and much more fluid than we see today, and around 6,000 nurses worked for the Union Army. Training was often lacking. There was no real requirement for experience at the time, so they got a lot of on-the-job training. Dorothea was really known for her requirement that nurses be over 30 years old, plain looking, and wear very plain uniforms. One of my favorite quotes from her was from a biography of her that I read when I was in middle school. And she made it very clear she didn't want any Florence Nightingales in her nurses. She didn't need any soldiers and nurses falling in love that would get between them and the healthcare and helping the people they needed to help. If you look at the screen here, the portrait is of a Mrs. Berry, and she, on the back of the photograph, is noted to have been a superintendent of a sanitary commission. So while Dorothea Dix was in charge of the Federal Union Army, there were other organizations such as aid services, sanitary commissions, who enlisted volunteers and sometimes even paid those volunteers to also offer healthcare. After the Civil War, women received no status as veterans and no benefits as such. This is a drawing of Harvey Hospital, and it's one of my favorite pieces. I think it's beautiful. And Harvey Hospital was here in Madison, Wisconsin. It was established by Cordelia Harvey following the death of her husband, Governor Lewis P. Harvey. She was named the official state sanitary agent for Wisconsin troops and visited Wisconsin soldiers in hospitals and toured around the country, visiting Wisconsin soldiers, really working to better their conditions. She went to Washington, D.C., and petitioned President Lincoln to establish hospitals in Wisconsin, truly believing that those who are injured and ill from Wisconsin would convalesce and recover better back home, out of the southern heat and humidity. The argument against that was people are going to defect. They're not going to come back to serve once they've recuperated. She really fought for that funding. She got the funding and proved that it was effective. These men healed up and then went back into service if they could. And then 2 more hospitals were established in Milwaukee and Prairie du Chien. This is a really cool certificate. It's the only one that I know of in our collection. And it belonged to a Mrs. Flick, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1837. The certificate indicates she served as an Army nurse in the Civil War and lists out a couple of things she might have done, and was signed by national president and secretary of the organization. This organization was established by Dorothea Dix after the war in 1881, so, a good time after the war had ended, when she realized that the women who had served in healthcare and nursing needed the same kind of fraternity that the men of the war got with the GAR. So it was established at one of the GAR meetings, as a pseudo veterans group, an auxiliary kind of veterans group, to offer fellowship to those women who had served as nurses. The only thing you needed to join this group was to be able to have proof of 3 months of either volunteer or paid service as a nurse during the Civil War. And then we move into World War I. Again, women are relegated mostly to healthcare. There was this establishment of the Army Nurse Corps in 1901. The Army realized they needed something more permanent than just ad hoc nursing as conflicts came up. So they started building this small group of women. So there were already some nurses enlisted when we entered World War I. In 1918, there were nurses at 198 stations with 2,000 regular Army and over 10,000 reservists. By the end of the war, more than 10,000 nurses were overseas and over 21,000 nurses were in service. Now, previously in the Civil War, women were not near the front lines. No matter really where you served, they tried to keep women back from the front lines, from the hospital. So in World War I, nurses were actually much closer to combat, especially in Europe. While some of the nurses were injured in combat, none of them died as a result, but many nurses did die of disease, often influenza and pneumonia. Now, notably, the Red Cross also supplied nurses, and they had casualties in their ranks, but that was not recorded by the United States government, as they were not part of the military, but an auxiliary service. And then we have the Navy. On March 17, 1917, the first woman enlisted in the Navy. More than 11,000 women joined her, working in naval districts across the United States, particularly in Washington, D.C. These women were classified as yeoman F, so female yeoman. They
So
often
not, if I could just interrupt, so not nurses.
Not nurses. They had their own nursing service, but these women were often clerks, typists, secretaries. So the Navy realized there was a role for women that they could fill beyond healthcare, beyond nursing, and really took advantage of the skills of women during World War I. Here we have Helen Bolovsky. She's from Madison, Wisconsin, and she was already a nurse when World War I broke out. She trained here at Madison General Hospital and graduated in 1917. In April 1918, she enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps. She was sent to the East Coast and spent time training at the U.S. Army General Hospital No. 9 before sailing to Europe with Base Hospital 22 in June 1918. She reported for duty in France on June 22nd. Base Hospital 22 was comprised largely of nurses and doctors from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was the Wisconsin base hospital in World War I. Now, in mid-July, she offered to transfer to an evacuation hospital. So she went from a base hospital that was further back from the lines of combat and volunteered to serve closer to the front, which is really remarkable for her because her father died when he was very young of a heart defect. And her family really strongly believes that Helen knew that she had that same heart defect. And there's even a story from the family that she hid that from recruiters. She lied and said her racing heart was because she'd run up the stairs and was so excited to serve. So she was serving very, very close to the front lines at a great sacrifice of her own health. And then in October and November 1918, she moved with her unit into Belgium following the advance of the armies of the Allies. After the war, she was stationed in Dunkirk through mid-January, and she ended her time in Europe back at Bow Desert. And then she sailed back at the end of February 1919. She died shortly after she came back to the United States in 1923, I believe. And the family really always believed that serving in the war had shortened her life. And another nurse with Base Hospital 22 is Hortense Troutman. Now, she was from Minnesota. She and her friend Florence Kimmy Kimball had volunteered to serve with the Minnesota Base Hospital, but they were full up on nurses. They didn't need any more nurses. They were told, you can try the Wisconsin hospital, they might still have some space. So they both went and volunteered and ended up going overseas with with Helen and serving at Base Hospital 22 in Beau Desert, France. This photograph is unidentified. We don't really know who this woman is. I really like to believe that it's Hortense because she was the first woman in charge of an outdoor influenza ward. When the influenza broke out, they ran out of hospital beds so quickly, they established outdoor wards. Now, this is remarkable because Hortense never got sick. She never contracted influenza despite the fact that she treated influenza patients exclusively for a long time. Her friend, Florence Kimmy Kimball, was not so lucky. She contracted the influenza and actually died in Beau Desert, France. Her grave was one of the first slides, and Hortense spent the rest of her life in healthcare working to understand why she survived, why so many of the men she treated survived, but her friend didn't. And these are just some of my more favorite images from our Base Hospital 22 collections. We have a couple here at the museum. So this is just nurses. The first image on the upper left there should be, is titled Fudge Party. Someone made fudge and the nurses were in their break room eating a little bit of fudge. That is the cemetery at Beau Desert there, and then gatherings of nurses taking portraits together and then cleaning up the different wards. And then as far as Navy service goes, we know that women were allowed to serve in the Navy outside of the sphere of healthcare. This photograph belonged to Sofia Dorothea Keller, who was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. She was living in Milwaukee when she enlisted in the US Navy and served as a yeoman third class at the Alice Chalmers Company in West Allis until the end of the war. She remained in the Navy and worked in Washington, DC as a clerk typist, like many women did. She wrote to her boyfriend at the time, who she later married, "Now I have lost all hope of ever returning to you, but I may be back in Milwaukee by the time you get home. My work may not be permanent. If Congress makes another appropriation to retain Yeoman F in the Navy, my present work will be permanent. If not, I'll be home by about July 1st. So because the war was ending, the female yeomen were really afraid that they would not be able to continue their service. A lot of them really enjoyed their service and finding that fulfillment in service outside of the sphere of nursing. The Navy had stopped recruiting female yeomen on November 11th, 1918, when the war officially ended, but did not fully demobilize the women until 1920. Supervisors for the female yeomen urged Congress to allow women to retain their jobs because they were so good at them. So this was Sofia saying, "I really hope I get to keep my job because I like my job, but it's up to the lawmakers." And then we come into World War II. So there are still nurses in healthcare. That continues. They're fully established, and actually they started ramping up enlistments when the war in Europe started. In 1939, they realized that there was an imminent threat of some kind. So they started building up the Army Nurse Corps with the assumption that something bad could happen very soon. In 1942, legislation was passed that allowed women to serve in the military outside of the sphere of healthcare, so outside of nursing and doctors and orderlies. The Navy moved from Yeoman F to WAVES, which stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Over 90,000 women served from all backgrounds. The Army had two branches of women that served. The WACS, which with two A's, which is the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and the WAC, the Women's Army Corps. This gets confusing because in July of 1943, legislation passed to drop the auxiliary from the WACs. That was so that they could mobilize forces of these women to go overseas and serve overseas in their various jobs to free up men overseas for combat. That legislation went into effect in July of 1943, like I said, and the demobilization of the double AWACS was supposed to happen by September, and anyone who didn't leave the service was supposed to enlist formally in the single AWACS. The Coast Guard had SPARS, which stood for Semper Paratus, Always Ready. The Army Air Corps, which was part of the Army, the Air Force had not been established yet in World War II, were the WASPs, and that stood for Women Air Force Service Pilots. The WASPs were formally disbanded in 1944. That was done by Congress. Their records of the women were sealed, and the women who were all over the country were responsible for finding and paying their own way home. These women were not considered veterans until 1977, and the 38 women who died in service did not automatically receive any military honors, and families had to petition to receive those honors. The Marine Corps had Marines. Female Marines are called Marines. They established the United States Marine Corps Women Reserves. A common nickname for these women were Lady Leathernecks. And then women held wide ranges of jobs across all branches of service. After World War II, Congress passed the Women's Armed Service Integration Act. So all of the legislation to put women into the military in 1942 had accidentally been set to expire. So actually in 1948. So as early as 1946, Army leaders requested that enlisted women may be made permanent parts of the military. For the following 2 years of legislative debate, Congress passed the Women's Armed Service Integration Act in 1948. The act granted women the right to serve as permanent regular members of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and recently formed Air Force. And then after World War II, women continued to serve in all aspects. This is Alice Doran, who was from Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. She served as a flight nurse in the US Air Force during the Korean War. She was assigned to the 801st Medical Air Evacuation Squadron, treating patients in transit, in flight, between bases in Japan and Korea. She remained in Korea for a year and was discharged as first lieutenant in December of 1952. This is Jean Christie, who actually served in the Red Cross. That is really interesting because they're not part of the military. They are an auxiliary organization. She served in Vietnam as a supplemental recreational overseas supplemental recreational activities overseas, SRAO, which oversaw recreational activities at bases and occasionally visited troops in the field. Known as donut dollies, the women of the SRAO units tried to bring comfort and a touch of home to the combat zone, to the soldiers in the field. Notably, after her service, Christie petitioned Congress for women who served in the Red Cross to receive some kind of benefit as veterans because of the things they saw and did to provide aid and comfort to these men and women in Vietnam.
Okay, so Brittany, I just want to point out to everybody that in between some of your sections, your history sections, we're sharing as many photographs as we can of women in our collections. And, thinking about all these things that women did, can you tell us a little bit more about what attracted these women to sign up to serve? Were there a lot of different reasons for that?
I would say that those reasons are as varied as men have. Thinking about how people decide to do things, most people don't write down at the time, I have decided to do this for this reason. So we really rely on reminiscences written afterwards. And a lot of those women have very varied reasons. Some go sign up for adventure. They want to see the world. They want to do something brand new. Some, it's a sense of duty and family duty. My father served, my grandfather served. I want to do something. A lot of women, it was wanting to help, to further the war effort out of patriotic duty. So I gathered a couple of different women talking about why they enlisted. And this is Helen Bolovsky again. And she wrote in her reminiscence that she wrote shortly after her service, "Oft I have heard of armies behind the army, behind the gun, but little did I think that my fireside dreams envisioned would materialize. When I joined the Army Nurse Corps, it was in early October of 1917 that I was released as a graduate nurse from the bonds of discipline in nurses training school. Caring for the sick was wonderful work, and I was happiest when I put my whole heart and soul into the care of my patients. When the cry for overseas nurses came, of course, I was anxious to go," which is the title of our program. That one kind of reaches out and grabs me because she was happy doing her job. She loved nursing, but when the time came, they needed people overseas. She jumped. She was ready to go, despite the fact that she knew that it might end her life earlier than otherwise. This is from Jacqueline Mullhern's collection. She was born in Indiana and raised in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and served as a major in the Wisconsin Army National Guard as a medical surgical nurse, field nurse, and mental health nurse from 1981 to 1944. She served in the 13th Combat Support Hospital, designated the 13th Evacuation Hospital in 1993. So she served in Operation Desert Storm. And in her reminiscence after her service, she wrote, "A constant question in my mind for that first 13 days is, what am I doing here?" Was answered later when I found I was able to, in my job as a nurse, help relieve the pain of the injured, function in spite of adversity, fulfill my duty to my country, and be a credit to my uniform, even at the age of 56.
So those are a couple of the answers that we have. Can you also talk about maybe some examples of feelings about serving once they got into service and what kinds of things happened while they were in service?
Sure. So this is Helen again. Her writing was really beautiful, so it's very easy to pull things from her writings. This is her shortly after she enlisted, and this is a quote from her reminiscence again. "While in the SOS, I listened to the horrors of the war as I nursed the wounded, but a call to the front line brought me and several other nurses face to face with all. It was evident that night duty was to be my lot. No one can picture the horrors in the wee small hours of the morning in the shock ward. The rush of the drive usually comes at night, because it was then that the faithful stretcher bearers took advantage of their opportunity and stole the wounded from the fighting fields." She also wrote, "And so one day after another was spent with little variation and at such long intervals that one could hardly tell whether it was the end of one day or the beginning of the next." She also wrote in her reminiscences that in training, her hospitals were so beautiful and clean and bright, and the beds were a nice height for you to bend over and work at. And in her evacuation hospital, it was feet of mud that they were standing on. And the cots were so low to the ground that she was grateful to only be 5 feet tall because she didn't have to crouch quite as far. This is Juanita Gould. She's from Baraboo, Wisconsin, and enlisted and trained as a WAC with 2 A's, so the auxiliary. She trained at the Officer Candidate School in Fort Des Moines, Iowa, graduating as a 3rd officer in the WAC. In July of 1943, when that legislation was passed, she transferred to the single A WAC and became a 2nd lieutenant. Then she trained for overseas training in Florida, including swimming lessons in the ocean. And she wrote in letters to her friend Ruth, who is standing here on the right of this photograph. This is her at her graduation in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. "Today, I'm sitting here in the midst of confusion. An order came out to all of us lost officers had to be off the post by Sat night. So out came the orders to Atlanta, San Francisco, New York, and several places in Ohio. I read names until I was nearly black in the face, but nary a Gould. There were 4 of us who'd been alerted last Friday, and we're the only ones left. I envied the ones going west. I was left upstairs alone with 54 empty beds, so I decided to move downstairs when I heard someone yell, 'Gould and Cat, so to go to the hospital, Ward 2 at 3 o'clock. What ward do you think that is? It's the mental hygiene ward. Well, to make a long story short, we laughed and giggled, and yet we're scared because going to a psychiatrist is no joke around here. See how it has affected me already.' She was crossing out words and misspelling things throughout her letter. She was so excited. When we got there, there was no one expecting us, so a little telephoning had to be done, and we overheard bits of the conversation, such as priority for overseas. My mind, now I'm more excited than ever, wondering what, when, who, and why, especially why me?" So she was excited about the prospect of going overseas, but confused as to how she ended up there. And in a letter home, she writes, "This overseas business is almost too good to be true, and maybe it won't turn out anyway. I haven't said anything to Mother yet, so I guess I'd better write to Verna and explain matters so they can sort of hint about a possibility." So even though she'd been training in Florida for some time, hopefully to go overseas, she still hadn't mentioned it to her parents because she didn't want to worry them that she might be headed to combat. And this is Eunice Android. She's from Stoughton, Wisconsin, and served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, so the AA WAC, eventually serving in the 669th WAC headquarters platoon as a clerk typist. So she served in Africa and Italy. And she wrote during training, "We were classified again this week. We had to give our first and second choice. My first was administration and the second was recruiting. I also listed a third and fourth as communications and post office." She also wrote, just like the speaker said in a lecture about a week ago, "If you're a stenographer, then you'll be a cook." And I don't care much for Fort Des Moines, but I do like being a WAC. So she was really excited about the prospect of training and wanted to get a job as quickly as possible. You know, jobs that required less training were really what she was looking at. And I think she was really happy with where she ended up.
So those are some really great reminiscences that you've shared with us. How about you talk a little bit about maybe some of the unusual jobs that you might say some of the women have held?
Sure. So jobs for women in, especially during World War II and beyond, ran the gamut. Women were pilots, women were clerks and typists, stenographers, secretaries, recruiters, mechanics, airplane mechanics, managers of post exchanges, cryptographers. The goal was really to replace men who were working, desk maybe jobs, definitely the clerks and the typists, and then any other job that those people could be freed up for combat was the goal, to place women in those roles. This is Margaret Hicks Crossan. She married while she was in service, so she enlisted as Margaret Hicks and was discharged as Margaret Crossan. She was from Berkeley, West Virginia, and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Women Reserve in May of 1943. She served as a supervisor in aerology in the Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point, North Carolina. Aerology, I had to look it up, was described at the time as a study of weather conditions. Newspaper articles from all around the country featured her photograph, and she was what they coined as a cover girl for the Marine Corps. So they used her portraits all over for different recruiting materials. So this is her seated at the front of this photograph looking at a map, reading instruments. And then this photograph featuring that large shiny ball was actually what ended up in newspapers, magazines, and all of the recruiting for the Women Marine Corps Reserve. And this is Juanita Gould again. So we already know that she trained in the auxiliary and then transferred to the Army. She was sent to Florida to do training for overseas service, which she was very excited about. Once she got overseas, she was sent to England and she trained as a cryptographer, which sounds really exciting to me. I was really hoping to find more details in her letters, but she was very conscious that her letters were being read by a censor. So they don't really talk about her day-to-day life or what she was doing in her job. They focus more on activities, new experiences overseas. And this is Eunice Android again. Like I said, she served in North Africa and Italy in World War II as a clerk typist. This photograph, though, doesn't look like a clerk typist. The Spaghetti Bowl was a football game played on January 4th, 1945, between the 5th Army and the 12th Air Force in Florence, Italy. And she was tapped to be a cheerleader for the game. So this is one of the photographs that we have from the game. And then after the war, she elected to work in Greece for the Corps of Engineers from 1947 to 1948 as a part of the Marshall Plan. And this is Eleanor Yuccam, I believe is how it's pronounced. She was born in August of 1918 and in Madison, Wisconsin. She was working as a clerk typist when she enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, Army Auxiliary Corps on March 8, 1943. And then in July 1943, when that legislation was passed, she was actually demobilized. She only served for 5 months as a recruiter for the WACs. And this is her sitting at her recruiting desk, hoping to bring more women into the service.
So, Brittany, in your research, have you also discovered any women who were firsts for something in their service?
Definitely. We have a lot of firsts in Wisconsin. So this is from Juanita Gould's collection again. This is from training. I love how they're all sitting out there eating. They're probably during some field training. After she trained in England, she continued her work as a cryptographer in Europe. On April 7th, 1945, Gould and 7 enlisted WACs were chosen to move to Heidelberg, Germany, and set up a cryptographic office. These women were some of the first WACs stationed in Germany on active service in World War II. This is from the Alinda Corbell collection. She was the first Wisconsinite to enlist in the Women's Army Corps and in the first graduating class of Women's Army Corps Officer Candidate School at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. If you look at her records and you compare them to Juanita's records, you might say, hey, Juanita enlisted first and graduated from that same school first. The difference here is Juanita enlisted as an Army auxiliary and Corbell enlisted as an Army. So she was the first Wisconsinite to enlist in the Army Corps and one of the first to graduate from Officer Candidate School. This is a very familiar collection to a lot of people who talk to me. This is Rhoda Zeesler. She is from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and was a captain in the United States Army Nurse Corps during World War II. When I mentioned before that the Army realized that they were probably going to need more nurses, something was happening in Europe, they started really ramping up the reserve enlistments and the move to non-reserve service, so active service for these nurses. So Rhoda had graduated nursing school and enlisted in the reserve and as a Red Cross nurse. She was tapped in 1943 to start training in 1940 as an active Army nurse. She trained for just over a year in Michigan and then spent a little bit of time in Louisiana before she was deployed to Hawaii in World War II. She arrived in Hawaii on November 8, 1941. So she was actually there when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And the next photo I will show you, this is a map, and I have two circles here. The one that's higher up is Schofield Barracks. That is where Rhoda was serving when Pearl Harbor was attacked. She was actually in the hospital on duty. She had gone to church in the morning and then got to the hospital. And as they stood out on, I believe, the back porch of the hospital, she was out there with some nurses and some orderlies. They saw the planes flying overhead and they thought it was a training mission of some kind. And one of the orderlies said, well, you can even see the rising sun on the tails of those planes. And they waved and didn't realize until about 10 a.m. that day when the first casualty rolled in from Wheeler Field, which is right next to Schofield Barracks, that the attack was real, that something had happened. And this image is one of my favorite on our collection. This is, again, from Rhoda's collection. And she captioned it, "A prize picture. Photos were forbidden, but I snapped this on May 30th after Pearl Harbor. Some of us nurses were selected to lay sprigs of flowers on the grave from December 7th. Lots of tears to shed. Most graves who unknown GIs were not wearing their dog tags." So this is not Rhoda in the photo, but she took this photograph when things were very secretive still and photographs were strictly not allowed. We talked earlier about WASP's service. This is the grave of Margaret J Seep. She was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and already had a private pilot's license in 1940. She was one of the first women to enlist in Wisconsin Civil Air Patrol in 1942 and actually trained so that she could train pilots in the Army Air Corps during World War II before enlisting as a WASP. She was in advanced training when a plane crash killed her, a fellow student, and an instructor. And then at the time of her death, since she was considered a civilian, her parents had to pay to have her body brought back from Texas. And they didn't receive any funeral honors for her until 2010. This is Roberta Wells. She was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Women Reserve in 1943 and worked as a clerk, typist, and recruiter all over the United States. When the option became available that you could train to serve overseas, she jumped at the chance. Her boyfriend at the time really tried to discourage her from doing more training so that she could go overseas, telling her, you know, that's not really respectable. You don't want to put yourself in that kind of danger. Your parents would not approve. She did it anyway. She didn't listen to him and ended up serving in Hawaii during World War II. She was part of the Marine Corps, like I said, and worked at the Public Relations Office, Public Affairs Office. And she was actually the first person to see the raising the flag on Iwo Jima photograph. She was developing the photos that day and described seeing it roll off the drum and realizing this is going to be very, very important. This photograph is going to be very important. So she actually kept a copy for herself. And then after the war, she actually ended up moving here to Madison. And this is a photograph of their baseball team, the Lady Leathernecks.
Well, in addition to some of those firsts, Brittany, you had mentioned some of the work that we have with our oral histories. And when I did work in the production of our I Am Not Invisible exhibit, which is an exhibit that can be rented out by anybody across Wisconsin or anywhere, actually, just for the cost of either getting it there, shipping or whatever. We discovered a few in their oral histories, some other Wisconsin women who were first. So one of them is Kimberly Stewart, and we discovered she was the first female electromechanical team chief. Yolanda Medina, and I'm sorry if I didn't say it correctly, first female aircraft environmental systems technician. And then Gay Mundy was the first female aide de camp to a commanding general, which just kind of blew us all away when we were going through some of the oral history transcripts. And we've tried to share on everybody's image on our banners in our traveling exhibit something that indicates their significance there in their time of service. And these are people who have more recently served. So we had the chance to gather their oral histories and write that information down. So I wanted to make sure that other people were aware of that. I think now would probably be a good time to kind of open up the floor for questions and see if there's any that people have had as we've been going along. And I know Eric's been probably tracking that for us, so we appreciate that.
I have been, and just let me screen share real quick. And of course, even though we practice our technical abilities before we start this, I'm having issues bringing up the PowerPoint, obviously. So what I'll do is I'll read the questions until I can get that to come up. 2 seconds here. There we go. The first question, Jennifer, out of all these women that you've discussed, what would you say, and for Brittany as well, what would you say they might have in common that led them to want to serve?
Well, I think Brittany is probably the most qualified to work on that because she has done the majority of the research.
You know, like the motivation to serve, that's a really varied answer for everyone who serves. I would say for most of the women whose collections I have been through, it's a desire to help and do more and help as much as they can. It's a desire to serve and to be of service, no matter what kind of job they had in the military.
Excellent. The next question, after working with a lot of the letters and journals and photographic collections, did you find any similarities with the women who served and their male counterparts?
Yes, a lot of similarities. A lot of these women, when you read letters and diaries, every single letter is a request for more letters. They all want to hear more from home. They want news, they want packages, they want to hear what's going on. They want to let their family know that they're okay. And they also really want to keep in contact with life back home so they don't feel like they miss out on anything. And that's, I think, one of the biggest is that desire for contact with home.
And as a veteran, I can totally sympathize and second that sentiment. Question straight from one of our attendees, Talisha. You have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, first I want to say thank you for hosting this this presentation, Brittany and Jennifer. It's always good to hear about women who have served in the military. I'm a woman and also a Navy veteran, so it's good to see this history. I just have a question real quick because going through this presentation, also, by the way, I have a master's in history and I did my master's thesis on Black women who enlisted during the Vietnam War and served in the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. I found this presentation to be a little very romanticized and very whitewashed. And I did hear you in the beginning, Brittany, that you depended strictly on the archives and you went what was existed in the archives, which was a collection of white women. And I've sat through many of these presentations. I've sat through many veteran conferences. I also work in military and veteran services, and I rarely ever see women who look like me. And I'm a third generation military veteran. My mom served, my aunt served, my grandfather served. And I still, in 2001, don't see women who look like me and my mother and my aunts in this. And it's really hard to keep hearing, we tried, but this is what we had. Like, what is your museum doing to go out there and get these collections? Because this is often what we need to start doing. And also since you didn't have these collections, maybe gave reference to certain policies that were restricted to Black women, Asian women, Native American women, Hispanic women, such as the fact that the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps and even the Red Cross banned the service of Black women, the segregation, things Truman had to deal with to integrate Black men and Black women in the military, maybe gave reference to those to have an inclusive voice, because I just felt it was very romanticized and very whitewashed.
Felicia, you're exactly right. And I apologize that we did not address that as well as we could have. It's very difficult to, as Brittany said, she was working with 45 minutes, but we could have done a better job. So I agree with you on that. Secondly, we are actively discussing in our collections committee, making those connections with folks like yourself who have a long record of service in your families, in trying to make a connection and make discussions of how we can improve our collections. And if that's something that your families are interested in sharing with us, we would love to work with you and people like yourself. And so we are working on making those connections. Recently, we have started making some connections with Native American communities, which have a high level of veteran activities. And our staff is working with making connections with African American and Latinos as well. So that is high on our priority list right now. And unfortunately, we did not do the best job that we could have here. And I appreciate your comments on that and your question too. I don't know if Brittany wanted to share anything else, but yeah, like she said that she was working with what she had, which is archivally, it's written or it's photographs. We have a much richer source material in our oral histories, and we should probably pull those out and do a better job with representation of different groups through our oral history collection.
And I would add to that too, in my research, and I rushed past it in the presentation, I apologize. When I was doing research into the building of the Army Nurse Corps, it was noted that in World War I, only 18 Black women were allowed to enlist in the Army Nurse Corps, and that was solely to treat influenza patients. And they were the first women to be discharged from the Army Nurse Corps in World War I as well. I really wish I had more to work with in the archival collection, and that is really something that we are taking steps to try to build that into our collection, and just try to build relationships within the community as well.
Thanks for fielding that question, ladies. If you're ready, I'll move on to some of our other questions that we have. Let's see, we just covered that one. This question basically says, I read about accounts from women passing as men in order to fight in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. Do you have any of these stories in your collections?
Unfortunately not. We've all heard those stories. If I had anything, I would happily share it. I've read a lot of newspaper accounts. I've heard a lot of stories, but in our collection, at least, that's not something we have.
Okay. Next question says, I can't remember if you've covered this, but when did the U.S. government start to recognize women's service as permanent?
That was 1948. So that was the Armed Forces Service Integration Act.
And then, do you have any documentation of what women experienced from their male counterparts while they were serving? Or were they welcomed in their service? Did they face discrimination?
That's a really great question. From what I have a lot of camaraderie, especially looking at World War I and World War II. There's a lot of camaraderie between the men and women. I am certain that women faced discrimination in all branches of service throughout all service. I know that we have documentation of it in our oral history collection specifically. In my research for this particular presentation, I did not find much.
Okay. Did women of World War I, oh, I'm sorry, I think I skipped one here. Did the women of World War I and World War II receive campaign ribbons, such as the ones men received for their service?
World War I, they did not. They were classified by Congress so that they were part of the armed services, but they did not receive any of the distinctions until much later. World War II, they would have, depending on where they were serving.
We're getting a lot of great questions here, so we're going to keep going through those. In your research, did you find that women mostly served in enlisted roles, or are there instances of women attaining officer ranks?
Women definitely achieved ranks as officers, especially in World War II through officer candidate school. And then in earlier conflicts, nurses were given ranks as lieutenants, I believe.
Okay. I do have a couple more questions. They came in a little bit later, so I did not get them worked into the PowerPoint, but let me go ahead and pull those up for you, if I can.
While you're looking for that, Eric, I'm hoping to share with all of the folks here that we have a traveling exhibit that I mentioned before. It is called I Am Not Invisible, and it came out of an awareness campaign featuring that originally began as a program featuring 20 photographs of Oregon women who are military veterans. It's now a nationwide program, and we participated in it. And so through the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs, along with us here at the Veterans Museum, we created our I Am Not Invisible exhibit to highlight many faces of diverse experience and important segment of the veteran community and to increase awareness about these veterans. And so I'm sharing with everyone in the chat feature a link to that traveling exhibit on our web pages, so you can see a little bit more about that. And that will also link you up to a number of oral histories about women who served. And that is one exhibit where we have expanded our diversity in including more women's stories from a much broader background. And I hope that everybody will take a chance to check out that link and then also link over to our oral history pages where those women have shared some of their stories of service with us.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. We'll move on to the next question. Brittany, what was the general attitude you think that these women faced when they made it known that they wanted to serve? Did they get a lot of, it's not appropriate for a lady to serve, or was there a lot of commendation for them wanting to volunteer for military service?
That largely depends on who they are talking to. In some cases, loved ones, employers, family members try to discourage these women from service for a variety of reasons. But if you look at the newspapers, the towns are always very excited if they have one of the first or the first. It really depended on what the job of the woman was and where they were going to be going.
Okay. And then did you come across any statistics regarding the number of women who have served either in the U.S. military or in a volunteer capacity? And specifically looking at each major action since World War II. I don't know if you have those sorts of numbers, but it'd be great if you could speak on that.
I don't have those numbers. When I was doing my research, I really focused on some very broad general information and then really wanted to dive into the stories in our collections, but I can look into it and get back to you.
That'd be great. And whoever posted that question, if you could send just one of us a quick chat, and we can definitely get some information back to you on. Next question, Brittany, what information, if any, does the Wisconsin Veterans Museum have regarding the treatment and safety of women with respect to their male service members, especially when you're talking about threats of maybe sexual harassment or physical assault? And did they have the ability to report these sorts of complaints through their chain of command?
So that kind of documentation would be in whatever orders and training manuals we have. A lot of women in our oral history collection speak directly to that kind of behavior. In my collection, based solely on what I have read, there has not been a lot that I have found that touches on that, and that could be generational, and it could also be women choosing to not donate any of that material. I do know that there are stories in our collection of women who witnessed or experienced assault at the hands of a male counterpart, and those experiences are terrifying and heartbreaking to read.
I can
or
imagine.
listen to.
Especially, I mean, it's terrifying and heartbreaking to read, any period, but particularly during times of war when the nation is supposed to be coming together, regardless if you're a man or a woman, and to still hear about those sorts of events happening. It would be terrible, absolutely. Ladies, that's all the questions that we have for today. And I would like to thank everybody for coming out to our event for our curator conversation. Like we said at the very beginning of the event, that March is Women's History Month. And so we do have more programming coming up revolving around women's history, Wisconsin female veterans, and those topics. On the 17th of March, we've been invited to participate in a Smithsonian event called Women in Aerospace, Stories from the Smithsonian Collection. And that is another free event. You can find that on our website and our events page, and it's free to register and attend that event. And then additionally, on March 22nd, we have our another curator conversations that's going to happen. And we're going to be talking about the wardrobe, get it? Examining the military service uniform for women over the periods of history that the museum covers. So if you are interested in any of those programs or any of our other upcoming programs, please feel free to visit our website, wizvetsmuseum.com. Go to our event page. Our events are all listed there, and they are all free to attend. And we hope to see everybody come back out for at least these other two events that we have coming up centered around Women's History Month, but we would love to see everybody attending all of our events since they are free and virtual. That would be fantastic. Again, Jennifer, Brittany, thank you so much for a great conversation today. Brittany, for all the great research and hard work that you've put into this. We greatly appreciate it. And like I said, just one last time, thank you again to everybody attending today. We greatly appreciate your attendance, and we would love to see everybody come back out. Thanks so much, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the afternoon.